It was hard for Mia to believe what she had seen. The feeling of betrayal she felt this time was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. Jonathan was the love of her life, and she had devoted everything to him. Nobody knew what to make of Mia White's appearance at the U.S. military base in Kuwait. Then she asked for her husband, and their jaws dropped. Only after finding his room did she learn the truth. As a result of her husband's lies, she was vengeful and ready to seek retribution against him. As soon as Mia decided to travel out to see her husband, she was overjoyed. The last time she saw his handsome face was months ago. In spite of the long and tiring flight from Michigan to Kuwait, Mia was sure it would all be worth it in the end. Finally, she would be reunited with the love of her life. A smile spread across Mia's face as she stepped off the plane. She found it nearly impossible to hide her excitement. She noticed a change as soon as she arrived at the U.S. military base. In the military base, Mia noticed that soldiers she had never met stared at her as soon as she stepped through the large gates. While some smiled politely and waved, others watched from afar, their eyebrows tightly tucked. Suddenly, she spotted a familiar face. Jonathan and Landon had been working together for years. Her pace picked up as she noticed that he was walking deeper into the base. "Landon!" she shouted. Seeing him pause in his footsteps, the woman watched him look around, trying to determine who had called his name. Then he saw her face. Landon's face fell as soon as he saw Mia's eyes. Mia was confused by this, but she didn't give it much thought as she ran towards him. "Hi, it's so nice to see you again," she said excitedly, giving the familiar man a big hug. However, he didn't share her optimism. Was there a problem? He scratched nervously at the back of his head while trying to smile. He was frowning deeply. Perhaps he was just surprised to see her. "Jonathan didn't mention you'd be coming here," he chuckled nervously. The fact that he seemed apprehensive did not surprise Mia. "I wanted to surprise him for Valentine's Day," she shrugged. "Where is he?" Things began to get weird at that point. Despite his best efforts, Landon was unable to answer Mia's question. Clearly, he was planning to say the right thing, but why? "Landon?" Mia questioned. In the midst of all this, she was becoming increasingly worried. It had been a week since she spoke to her husband. Could something have happened? "Mia, I have to go," he said, with a glint of sadness in his eye. He turned around and walked away, leaving Mia alone and confused. She was on her own in finding her husband. While she couldn't understand Landon's strange behavior, she was confident that, eventually, she would find her husband as she walked from unit to unit. A voice she recognized all too well soon caught her attention as she looked toward a group of small huts. He was laughing with someone, and it was her husband. Upon reaching the hut, she pushed the door open with excitement. It broke her heart to see what was inside. What was he thinking? She never imagined she would marry a military man while growing up in a small town in Michigan. It was unlikely that her dream man would be a soldier. As a child, Mia dreamed of marrying a chef or an English teacher. Then she met Jonathan, and everything changed. It was when they met at a neighborhood barbecue that Mia had one of the most memorable nights of her life. The man completely captivated her. In addition to being handsome and funny, Jonathan listened carefully to everything she said. It was beyond belief that she had been so lucky. As they talked about their hopes and dreams, they spent the entire evening together. It was then that she discovered Jonathan was a military man. "I'm here for the next 6 weeks. After that, I'll be in Kuwait for a few months," he explained. When Mia heard that he would be leaving so soon, she was strangely disappointed. She gave him her number without hesitation that night when Jonathan asked for it. The following weekend, he asked her out for the first time. During those 6 weeks, Mia spent several days with the soldier, and she was certain that she had fallen in love with him. "I'll be back before you know it. We'll call every day, I promise," he said before kissing her goodbye. Watching him leave was extremely painful, but he was right. Those few months passed in the blink of an eye. They called each other at least 3 times a week, and before she knew it, he was on his way back home. Mia waited at the airport, and as soon as her eyes found him, her stomach filled with butterflies. He was the man she wanted to be with. It was during that time that the pair began dating. This cycle continued for an entire year before he finally got down on one knee and popped the question. Mia was certain that marrying Jonathan was the right thing to do. He'd met her family, and everybody loved him. They began planning the wedding right away, and Jonathan already knew who his best man would be. His name was Landon, and they had worked together for years. Love was in the air, and as the months passed, they planned the perfect wedding. Before they knew it, their big day arrived. That morning, Mia woke up with the widest smile on her face. Finally, she was going to get married to her best friend. She spent that morning with her family, preparing for the wedding. When she saw her husband on the aisle, her heart swelled in her chest. He had a wide grin on his face. It was clear that this was one of the proudest moments of his life. Her eyes trailed to the man beside him. That was the first time she laid eyes on her husband's best friend, Landon. The wedding was a massive success, and Mia was overjoyed. That night, they celebrated with all of their family and friends. To Mia, it was the best day of her life. She was always surprised to find out how nice his friend Landon was. However, shortly after the wedding, it was time for Jonathan to take a flight back to the U.S. military base in Kuwait. Mia was extremely sad to see him go. The first few months of their marriage were tough. Jonathan was off in Kuwait while she stayed at home, all alone. All she wanted was to spend her time with her new husband, but now she was home alone as a newlywed. Valentine's Day was coming up, and she wanted to spend it with Jonathan. She thought about asking Jonathan to come home for Valentine's weekend, but then she had an even better idea. What if she flew out to Kuwait and surprised her husband for Valentine's Day? The night she had the idea, she decided to buy the plane tickets. Knowing that she would be seeing her husband in just 8 days, got her through the week ahead. She couldn't wait to see the man she loved. That week passed in the blink of an eye, and before Mia knew it, she had stepped foot in the U.S. military base where her husband had been living. When she saw Landon's familiar face right by the entrance, she decided to approach him. "Do you know where Jonathan is?" she asked, smiling. But there was something different about Landon. He didn't seem to want to speak to her, and he definitely didn't want to tell her where her husband was. This made Mia feel extremely uncomfortable. Had something happened to her husband? She tried to ask Landon again, but he simply walked away. Mia couldn't understand why he was giving her the cold shoulder. They'd gotten on so well at the wedding, but now he was ignoring her. In the pit of her stomach, she could sense that something just wasn't right. She had to find her husband. But was he even there? She began to wander around the place, her heart beating steadily in her chest. But she wasn't prepared for what was about to happen. She had to find her husband on her own. She couldn't understand Landon's strange behavior, but as she walked from unit to unit, she was certain she could find her husband eventually. But as she approached a group of small huts, she heard an all-too-familiar voice. It was her husband, and he was laughing with someone. The sound of his laughter sent shivers down her spine. For months, she had longed to hear that sound on purpose, but she had no idea what she was in for. Mia was about to enter the hut when her eyes found that same familiar face again. Landon was standing just feet away watching her. But then she noticed something. His expression was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Landon was staring at her with compassion in his eyes. What on earth was going on? Mia was confused. His eyes held a certain kind of sadness she had never witnessed before. It was like he pitied her. But why? "Is everything all right?" she asked him. His eyes diverted from hers to the ground below him. Something just wasn't right. She could still hear her husband's voice as he continued to speak to someone inside the hut. Mia assumed it was one of their fellow soldiers, but just then, Landon shook his head and said something she never expected to hear. "I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry," he said. That was when Mia noticed something. She could hear the voice from inside the hut that didn't belong to her husband. It was a woman's voice. Her eyes left Landon's disappointed face as she turned back to the hut. Who on earth was in there with her husband? She had to know. She placed her hand against the door, her eyes wide as she pushed the door open. But when she saw what was inside, her heart sank. How could he do this? Tears immediately sprung to her eyes when she found her husband. The second he saw her face, his skin paled. She had arranged a surprise visit to spend Valentine's Day with the man she loved, but it seemed his secret girlfriend had done the same. They were on his bed, chatting and holding each other. Mia felt like she was going to be sick to her stomach, but that day would have more surprises than one. From the moment she met him, Mia thought Jonathan was the closest thing to perfection she had ever seen in her life. But now, she knew better. He was a cheater and a liar. She wondered how long he had been seeing other women behind her back. She thought back to what Landon had said. He should have told her sooner. Did he know about this before the wedding? Mia couldn't believe her eyes. Never in her life had she felt so betrayed before. She was so in love with him, and now she knew that it meant nothing. "Mia!" Jonathan said breathlessly. It felt like his throat was swelling shut as he stared up at the woman he'd claimed to love so much. Mia raised a hand, stopping him from saying another word. "I will be filing for a divorce as soon as I get home," she said, and she meant it. Jonathan called Mia's name as she stormed out of the hut, tears streaming down her face. As soon as she got out, Landon was standing there, waiting for her. The second she walked toward him, he embraced her in a tight hug. "Did you know about this?" she cried. Landon nodded. "I found out a few weeks after the wedding. I am so sorry. You deserve so much better," he said. Landon took Mia toward the hut he stayed in and let her have a seat on one of his chairs. She was a sobbing mess while he was furious. She was grateful to have a friend like him who could help her during this time. "I loved him so much. I thought he was perfect," she cried. Landon didn't say too much, but he remained close, comforting the woman he'd only met once or twice. When he learned the truth, he knew Mia was too good for Jonathan. Later that day, Mia left and got on a plane back to the U.S. Her heart was torn to shreds, and she couldn't believe how her trip had ended. She couldn't stop thinking about Jonathan and the beautiful woman by his side. She always thought it was too good to be true, and it was. Jonathan tried calling a few times, but she refused to answer the phone. As far as she was concerned, it was all over for them. The next day, she spent her day in bed, crying and processing what had happened. Around noon, she made the decision to call a divorce lawyer. Jonathan wouldn't be home for a few more weeks, and she was grateful for this. She didn't want to see his face anytime soon. As the months passed, she settled her divorce with the man she once loved. He tried again and again to get her back, but he was too late. She wanted nothing to do with him. As time passed, Mia slowly learned how to move on from what had happened. It hurt, but it taught her a lot about life. She moved into a place of her own and slowly began rebuilding her life. But one day, the unexpected occurred. When she heard the knock on her door, she wondered who it could be. But as soon as the door swung open, she found Landon with a bouquet of roses in his hand. That was the start of her next chapter.